Welcome to Stranger Than Fiction, where you can test your ability of keen observation. Listen to 3 stories and see if you can pick out which story is true. Living in England, each town and city has its own history, ripe with many great stories. However, some places hold a sinister secret. Listen to this story of a man making a disturbing discovery in his new town and see if it has an air of truth. What I'm about to tell you is the culmination of months of research. Research that I will not be continuing past posting it here. In fact, once it's posted, I'd be happy to never hear of it again. Where do I begin? Well, a few months ago, I finished university and moved to the north of England to live with my partner. Her family lives up here, and there were plenty of job opportunities, so I thought nothing of it. My own family, living in the east of England. I like to think of myself as a history buff, so once we moved into our new home, I started to do a little research about the local area. It's always something I've done whenever I've moved in the past, as it often means that you can understand the local area and the people who live in it a lot more. During my studies, I came across numerous death records that had the same cause of death: mine collapse. Again, I thought nothing of it, as this is the north of England. Mining was the main industry here, a notoriously dangerous industry that claimed the lives of so many men, young and old, in past times. What was a little more gruesome, however, was the discovery I made next. Whenever someone was caught in a mine collapse, their bodies were never recovered. It was deemed a waste of work time to retrieve the bodies of men who were almost certainly dead, so the foremen and the mine owners would not allow it. The logic of this, though deplorable by modern standards, could almost be argued as reasonable, if it was not for the personal collected amounts of some of the ex-miners from years later. They recall events like this happening all the time. They would beg to be able to retrieve the bodies, but to no avail. The men were already dead. What would be the point? However, this was not always the case. Many men were simply trapped by the mine collapse or just injured. Still, the surviving men were not allowed to dig them out. Some tried and were fired instantly for, quote, lazing on the job. As the remaining men dug deeper into the mines they were working on, some swear they could hear the muffled cries of the men they had been forced to leave to die. They would leave the pits at the end of the day and have to look the wives and children of these men in the face and lie to them, telling them their loved ones had perished, but always knowing the truth, that they had left them to die for fear of their own jobs. Upon reading this information, I couldn't help but feel that this was a little far-fetched. I would consider myself a highly rational person, and the idea that less than a century ago this kind of thing was allowed to happen seemed highly unlikely to me. It was likely just a collection of horror stories that the downtrodden miners would tell each other in their mutual hatred of the men who were sending them down to the mines for little pay whilst reaping the rewards of their hard graft. Certainly, I knew the parts of the stories about the mine collapses were true. The records were there for all to see. But leaving a poor, trapped soul to their fate in the name of profit? No, I refuse to believe that the miners would not have made every effort to retrieve the men who survived. God be damned. That was until the next bit of information I received. Many of the mines in the north are now museums that keep the heritage of the local area alive and give brief snippets as to what life was like up here when the mines were operational. A friend of the family works at one of these museums as a guide, and he very helpfully agreed to help me out with my research, sending me a little bit of interesting bits of information. I met with him at the museum and told him about the stories I'd heard, hoping for a discussion about how absurd it all was. All I received was silence in return. He slowly got up and walked away from me into a section of the museum marked staff only. I waited for a good 5 minutes, but there was no sign of him. Presuming that I had somehow offended him, I asked another member of staff if he could go fetch him for me so that I could apologize. A couple of minutes later, he returned, explaining that my friend had gone home for the day as he was, to quote, feeling ill. I was quite upset at this, as the last thing I wanted to do was offend anyone with the information I had found. So, I drove over to his house to try and explain myself and reconcile. His partner answered the door, and upon asking for him, told me the exact same thing, that he was feeling ill and had gone to bed. Deciding it was probably best not to disturb him, I headed home, deeply perturbed by what had happened. When I eventually got home, I discovered an untitled email from my friend waiting for me in my account. There was a file attached entitled Crockhope Mine Excavation Report. He had written in the email, quote, "This is a classified document. Read it and then delete it from your laptop. Or better yet, don't read it at all and just delete this email. I'm not sure you'll like what you read. In any case, start from page 23. It seemed odd to me that I was being warned not to read a simple archaeological report, but nonetheless, there was clearly important information in here for it to be classified in such a way. It did make me wonder though, why would there be classified information files in a museum? And why did they make my friend react in such a bizarre way? I forced myself to think about whether this was too much, whether I had probed too far for what was supposed to be just a passing interest. But then again, I hadn't asked for this information, or indeed even tried to seek it out. So what harm was there in reading it? After deliberating this for a while, I decided to go ahead and read it. I opened the file to find a 57-page report on the findings and procedures involved in the excavation of the mine in 1995, prior to its conversion into a museum in 2001. As instructed, I scrolled to page 23 and began to read. The report stated that, as expected, they had recovered a number of human remains. What was deemed to be unusual, however, was the number of strange marks found on the bones and whatever remaining flesh of the corpses. The report then stated that it was believed that these marks were caused by an animal or collection of animals of some description that had found the miners' bodies long after they had died and feasted on their corpses. This was about as much information as I wanted to read. I understood now why my friend had gone so pale and immediately left when I brought up the subject in the first place, and I also understood why this information was classified. These poor souls had been left to die, and their remains had been devoured by random animals. Not exactly what you want plastered on the walls of a museum, is it? I was ready to delete the file. when I noticed something odd. The file had 57 pages according to the computer's page counter, and yet the contents of the book only went up to 56. So, what was on the extra page? I quickly scrolled down to find an image of a page scanned from an autopsy report. As it turned out, it was an autopsy report of the bones collected from the mine. My initial conclusion was that they must have done further investigations into the identities of these poor men. I was partially right. As I read the report, I quickly started to realize the awful truth. Findings had shown that the mysterious marks on the bones were made by human teeth. The marks had been cross-referenced with each of the skulls retrieved, and it had been found that one by one, the men had turned to cannibalism to stay alive. Some of the bones having more than one individual set of teeth marks on them, suggesting that the miners, in their desperation, had turned on one of their brethren for nourishment. I couldn't read anymore, out of a sheer sense of both sickening horror and overwhelming pity. I couldn't bring myself to read any more of the report. These files weren't just classified in order to stop the museum from looking bad, but to protect the family's memories of the miners who had perished. After all, who wants to know that their grandfather ate his friends? The mining era in England was a prospective time for trade, but a dark time for its workers. Did this morbid practice really happen during this era? In reality, walking in a forest alone is a relaxing hobby, akin to meditation, especially if you're into photography, like our next unlucky protagonist. Let's see what happens when a solemn walk is interrupted by some rather strange events. For the past 2 or 3 years now, I have taken long walks through the forest just behind my house, mostly when I'm bored and there's nothing to do. It can get rather lonely living in a small house far away from any town or city. I never had any real problems with these walks, nothing that would ever cause me to feel nervous or uncomfortable. This all changed during the winter of 2010. It was during what was known as the Big Freeze of 2010. I looked out my windows at about 11:30 in the morning, and the whole forest behind my house was layered with snow. Because I was into photography at the time, I decided to go out and take pictures of the winter landscape and some trees from within the forest. I went out into the snow and made my way into the forest where I usually like to have a walk. I had a small digital camera tucked away in my coat pocket. As I entered, the beauty of the forest amazed me, and I began to take pictures. However, as I was about to take the next picture, the camera stopped working. I didn't think about it much, and just decided to continue walking anyway. That is when I began to have this strange feeling. The snow stopped falling, the sounds of birds stopped, and the blistering cold came to a halt. There was this horrible feeling of loneliness looming over me that I had never felt before. I continued walking, hoping that something would rid me of this feeling. Even something like a caw of a crow, even though it's not a pleasant sound, would at least let me know that I wasn't alone. As I continued this walk, there was suddenly a loud crack, then the sound of something crashing onto the bare forest floor. I jumped and looked behind me, noticing that one of the very young trees was lying on its side. My eyes scanned the forest, thinking that someone or something was behind me. I saw nothing. I had come to the conclusion that it was probably just some snow weighing the tree down, or perhaps the soil or roots were loose, causing it to fall. The feeling of loneliness had left me completely. A new feeling had come to me, a feeling that I was being followed, even though it was unlikely that there would be anyone else in the forest. I decided to continue. As I walked, there was another loud crack. I looked down, thinking that I stepped on a stick, but there were no sticks around me. I then looked behind me. Perhaps it was a bird, I thought to myself. I scanned the woods again, this time for longer, desperately looking for the source of the loud noise. Then, I saw it. My eyes fixed on this tall figure far in front of me. It was a tall man. It stood by a tree, and the trunk of a tree covered half of its long, thin body. It had a long, thick, dark cloak covering every inch of it. No skin or other body features were visible. It was perfectly still, not moving in the slightest. I stepped away slowly, not taking my eyes off it, but as my foot crunched down into the thick snow, it turned. It had 2 holes cut into the fabric of the cloak. Its eyes were not visible. We stared at each other for about a minute before I decided to turn and walk away. I didn't want to turn away from it, nor did I want to look at it. I just kept walking. My mind was in a complete mess. I don't know if I was being foolish because I was scared. Perhaps it's just some tall man in a cloak going around trying to scare me as some kind of strange joke, I thought to myself. I peered over my shoulder, hoping that it had not moved. It was still there, not moving, its eyes staring at me as I walked away from it. As I got further and further away, I looked behind me and noticed it was closer. I began walking faster and faster, but I did not run. I looked behind me to see if it was there, but it wasn't. I thought it was hiding behind a tree, but it was not in sight. I decided to go back because it had clearly left. For the first time in what seemed like a long time, I felt somewhat calm. I knew I wasn't alone, but at least I knew I wasn't being followed. I walked back at a very steady pace, even though I wanted to get back to my home as quickly as possible. I made my way to the edge of the forest, and I took one final look behind me. I was hoping I would see nothing, but I was wrong. There it was again, and all my fears came rushing back. It was a few hundred yards away and approaching. It moved majestically across the snow and past the trees. I tried to ignore it, even though I was too terrified. I left the forest at a quick pace. My heart was pounding, and I quickly ran back towards my house. I glanced back, only to see it make its way back into the woods, its eyes staring at me constantly, its thick, black eyes locked onto me. Its cloak brushed the branches of the trees as bits of snow tumbled down onto its cloak. Then it was gone. Its tree-like body disappeared into the foliage of the woods. For one moment, I felt safe. When I got back into my home, I locked all the doors and closed the curtains, even though I didn't know what it was. I knew that it stalked me while I was in the forest. For all I know, it could have been a man trying to scare me. But I know that I will never go back into those woods again after that experience. It was a strange experience. There's something disturbing by the fact that we can pick up when we're being watched, despite not knowing where it's coming from. It's especially worse when we're isolated from society when this happens. Was this grim story of an innocent hike gone wrong real, or just another story of fiction? A famous quote that some people live by is living is easy with your eyes closed. It's easy to think highly of the world when you ignore disturbing events. However, when it's your job to investigate these events, it's easy to have your life's perspective changed. I retired as a detective a long time ago. Some people are sad at the idea of retirement, but to me, it couldn't come any faster. I was more in line with the prior, until one case that shook me to my core. It started at the end of 1980. The precinct received a tip that a girl was hurt. A woman, Karen Potak, was beaten to within an inch of her life. She had received severe wounds and a brain injury. If it wasn't for the call, we may not have saved her. As an isolated incident, this would have been a shocking event with a nice ending. But what it led to was nothing short of horrifying. 6 months later, we found a body. Her name was Kimberly Compton, an 18-year-old student. She was stabbed to death with an ice pick and left for people to find. We knew it was an ice pick from the bizarre thing that happened after. We received a call from the killer, and it was nothing short of chilling. I still don't know if he was trying to antagonize us or if he was genuinely remorseful that he was still at large. He said things like, "God damn, will you find me?" and "I can't stop myself, I keep killing somebody." It was in this call that he specified that he'd used an ice pick, which helped us identify that this was not a prank. Things only got more disturbing from there. A few days later, we received another call, this time in a different tone. He was not screaming, he was not livid, he was not angry, he was not what you'd expect a killer to sound like. He was whimpering. In a barely coherent voice, he cried, "I'm sorry for what I did to Compton." This baffled us at the offices. We obviously knew these were crocodile tears, but there were so many questions. Why was he so sad, despite being in control of what happened? Why was he calling to tell us in the first place? And what did he mean by, "I keep killing somebody"? This implied there was more, or that there's going to be more. The next anomaly was the killing of Kathleen Greening. She was found just outside her home, dead. A confusing case at first. She was killed by drowning. later shown to have been done in a bathtub. This had us puzzled at the time, and we were doing all we could to find any links to other cases. However, while this was happening, another case popped up. Barbara Simmons, a 40-year-old nurse, was found dead. She had met someone at a bar. She reportedly told the waitress that, to quote, "He's cute, I hope he's nice, since he's giving me a ride home." Little did she know that she took a ride with a suspect that we were starting to link to all these murders. She was found the next day, stabbed to death. After this, we received another call, which was just as chilling as the others. He said, "Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. This was information not known to the public, confirming yet again that this was the same guy, and he was telling the truth. After each call, I'd barely be functional. As a kid, you're taught that you should feel remorseful after a bad deed. But this level of apathy really put into perspective how disturbing some people are in this world. The investigation didn't make me feel any better. The bodies were piling up, and this sicko was surprisingly careful. We were no closer to catching him from the first time he showed up. This all came to a head after a lucky break from an unfortunate incident. The killer picked up a 19-year-old prostitute named Denise Williams in mid-1982. She sensed something wrong with him when he began driving her through a dark suburban area rather than taking her back to the city where he picked her up from. After turning onto a dead-end road, he stabbed her 15 times with a screwdriver. While this was happening, she managed to fight back. She hit him on the head with a bottle, cutting his face and head. She was screaming all the while, and this managed to catch the attention of a person who lived nearby. After seeing what was going on, the passerby wrestled with him, causing him to flee the scene. This man then called an ambulance for Denise and notified the police. Our lucky break came from the killer's mortality. When he got home, he apparently saw how badly he was bleeding. Worried, he called emergency services for medical attention. It was because of this call, plus the passerby's testimony, that we managed to identify the killer and make an arrest. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to link him to all the murders, but with the links to the murder of Barbara Simmons and the attempted murder of Denise Williams, he was sentenced to 40 years. In prison, he was diagnosed with cancer, and it was then we finally got our answers. He confessed to all the loose ends we had. On top of the crimes he was convicted of, he confessed to the beating of Karen, the stabbing of Kimberly, and the drowning of Kathleen. This was not a happy ending for me, or anyone else working the case. This many deaths was a lot to take in. It really put into perspective how easy it can be for someone to get away with senseless killings. Premeditated is one thing, but truly random crimes are terrifying. And knowing they can just happen out of the blue really changes the way you live life. Changes the way you see strangers. It messes with your head and makes trust something you lock away deep inside, never to give away. My life has been plagued with after effects of this case, and I would never wish this curse on my worst of enemies, and I've made some pretty bad ones on my way. My only consolation is that he's dead. The cancer he had being the death sentence we couldn't give him. Because of all this, I'm still hesitant when I pick up a phone. It's sad when a life is taken prematurely. It's worse when it's done by such a psychopath. Did this story of a serial killer who taunted his investigators during every step really happen? So, now that you've listened to all three, let's see if you have what it takes to pull the truth out of the fiction. Is it the first story of a man who innocently researched the town he just moved to, only to find its sinister secret? How about the second story of a lone photographer who wasn't as alone as he thought? Or was it the third story of an investigator antagonized by the monster he struggled to catch? Feel free to pause the video now and lock in your answer in the comments below. Story 1 was actually a creepypasta by the name of The Minds from the CreepyPasta Wikia. Story 2 was also a creepypasta by the name of The Lonely Man, also from the Wikia. If you guessed it was Story 3, you were right. This story was based on the notorious serial killer Paul Michael Stefani, also known as the weepy-voiced killer based in the Minnesota-Wisconsin area. Did you get it right? Congratulations if you did. Until next time, where we determine if reality is stranger than fiction.